Welcome to my second positioning guide. In this one, we will go over how to position in the early, mid, and late game, how to position with specific synergies like infiltrators and snipers, as well as going over how to position with certain items. Before you understand how to position in the early game, you need to know what the big threats are. Common threats in the early game are blitzcrank, infiltrators, and AoE spells that either CC or damage your team. The big AoE in the early game comes from Graves, Rakan, Nautilus, and Ahri. These units are relatively common in the early game. 3-cost units like Jace, Nico, Rumble, and Ashe also have big AoE spells, but are not as common in the early game. You need to scout to see which of these threats are in the lobby, so you can position well for them. Generally, versus big AoE spells, you want to spread out, and versus infiltrators and blitzcrank, you want to turtle or box up. Now let's move on to some general positioning setups that you can run in the early game. Obviously, if you have champs with specific abilities, you want to position a little bit differently, but you will do well with these in most situations. In this clip, I start scouting to see where I can get the best Nico stun off, as well as the best Ahri ult angle, so my positioning is based on how the others are positioned and I'm not running a general positioning setup. So the first one, at level 3, you want to have 2 tanks and 1 carry unit, or 1 tank and 2 carry units. You never want to have 3 carries as you have no frontline, and if you're running 3 tanks, you need them to be 2-starred if they're going to do any damage. If you have 2 tanks, you have 2 different positioning strategies. You can backline everything like this. Here you're safe from an enemy blitzcrank, as your TF will never get pulled. Also, if you're getting jumped by infiltrators, they only have a 50% chance to attack your TF, and if they do, the tanks will help cleaning up the infiltrators. If you scout and see that there are no blitz or infiltrator players, you can position like this. Here you have a different problem, now you're weak to AoE spells. So in this case you can move Saya 1 down and move Malphite 1 to the left if there's a lot of big AoE on that side. If you have 2 carries and 1 tank, you always want to position like this. This is because here all the 3 units will focus down the same target. You can't afford to play around blitzcrank or infiltrators when you only have 1 tank, therefore having 2 carries is a high risk, high reward type of strategy to run early game. But still, it's important to play the strongest board, so don't take out a 2-star carry for a 1-star tank that doesn't give you any synergies. At level 4, you want to be running 2 tank, 2 carries, or a 3 tank, 1 carry board. If you're running 2 carries, you can either turtle and position like this to defend against infiltrators, and then swap sides to not let your Caitlyn get hooked by blitzcrank. Or you can position like this, where you have your tanks in the front and 2 carries in the back. If there's a lot of big AoE, then move TF down closer to Caitlyn. If you only have 1 carry, you can turtle to position against infiltrators and blitzcrank, or you can move up on the right or left side. Here TF will never get targeted by infiltrators or blitzcrank, but he's still vulnerable to AoE spells. The advantage of this positioning is that TF won't walk up into the other team like he might do when you're turtling. At level 5 you want to have 3 tanks and 2 carries, or 4 tanks and 1 strong carry. Sometimes you can also run 2 tanks and 3 carries if your tanks are 2-starred and or have some items as well. If you're running 2 DPS, you either full turtle or you have 2 tanks in the front, and last one can be anywhere to either deal with infiltrators or it can be a bit further out. This way he walks up a bit later into the fight and also has a chance to catch infiltrators jumping to the other side. If you're running 1 carry, you either full turtle or position TF in the cubby. Here you have 2 Malphites in front and 1 in the backline. The 4th one can be anywhere to either catch infiltrators or be in front with the others. Just note that if you full turtle with 4 tanks, you will trap one of them if you position on the right side, as he has nowhere to walk up. If you're running 3 carries, you can turtle and protect your main one in the middle, or you can run the classic 2 tanks in frontline and the carries behind them. Before I end the early game segment, I want to stress again that these are general positioning setups. Some carries want to have different ultimate angles and some tanks want to be targeted first. If you want to learn how to position every single unit in the game, I will leave a link to a video where I go through all of that. In the mid game, people are starting to get more 3-cost units into their comps, and some 4-cost units might start showing up as well. Big AoE spells are more common in this stage of the game, but the old threats from infiltrators and blitzcrank are still relatively common. Therefore, you want to be a bit more careful with clumping up, but as always, scouting to see which threats are in the lobby and which aren't is still very important. There's no point positioning against blitzcrank if nobody's running him. At level 6, you have a mid-game carry that is your main priority to protect. You also have secondary carries, tanks, and support units. Most of the time, you will have 2 DPS units and 4 tanks, or you have 3 DPS units and 3 tanks. If you're running 3 DPS, you can do the classic 3 tanks in front and 3 carries in the back. This is generally a very safe positioning during the mid game. If there are a ton of infiltrators, move one tank down to do a mini turtle, and have the other 2 tanks in front to block the big AoE. You can also move your main carry to the cubby if there's no AoE hitting that hex. If you're running 2 DPS with 4 tanks, you can either do a full turtle around them, or you can run 3 tanks in the front with your main carry in the cubby and secondary carry in the backline. The last tank can be next to the Ezreal to help with infiltrators, or it can be left towards the middle of the 3rd row to catch infiltrators jumping to the other side, while not spending as much time walking up. At level 7 you start to piece your comp together, and at this stage in the game forecast units are becoming more and more common. From here, how you should position will change a lot based on the different units and synergies you have. But you will still do fine having 4 tanks in the front, main carry in the cubby, and supporting units or secondary carries in the back row. If there are a lot of big AoE spells, you can split up your frontline and backline, while still protecting your main carry a bit. Again, these are general positioning tips. If you are running a Wukong, you want to see where you can knock up the most units, and if you're running Jinx, you need to see where you can get the easiest resets off. In the late game, you have your comp online and so does everyone else. Therefore, your positioning will be specific to a certain comp, and it's hard to give general advice on how to position with every single comp. The most important thing you need to think about when positioning in the late game is trying to remember who you have played, so you know who you need to position against and who you don't need to position against. When there are 8 people left, you can't face the last 4 people you fought. When there are 7 people left, you can't face the last 3 people you fought. When there's 6 people left, you can't face the last 2 people you fought. And when there's 5 or 4 people left, you can't fight the last guy you fought. The system also completely resets if one player dies, so if you just fought someone, but a player died in that same turn, you can fight against him in the next turn. This might sound like a lot to take in, but in the late game there are a few macro decisions left, and it's all about making good micro decisioning to outplay your opponents through positioning. Another important tip is to swap your positioning in the last couple of seconds every turn. This way people think you're positioned differently than you actually are. This way you can catch people off guard if you're moving your zephyr or infiltrators after your opponents have scouted you. If you're not sure how to reposition your board, sometimes just swapping sides will help as other people are positioning for you in some cases. It's also very important to utilize items like Zephyr and Shroud in the late game, and I go over how to do that later in the video. Let's go over some synergies that require you to position differently than you would with other units. Infiltrators jump to the other side of the map at the start of the fight. It doesn't matter if they're on front row or back row, it always takes them 0.6 seconds to jump to the other side. When positioning infiltrators, you need to scout to see where the majority of the enemy carries are, and then pick that side. You almost never want them in the middle, as they often just walk up to the front line instead of walking to the back line. They also work best in groups, so if you're running multiple, position them together so they burst down carries together. The biggest counter to infiltrators is turtling. Here the infiltrators will jump to the front line as there is no free hex next to the carries they can jump to. Whenever someone is turtling, don't position infiltrators against them, look to position for the other non-turtling players. Snipers deal more damage the farther away the enemies are, therefore you almost always want your front line on front row and your snipers on back row in the corners. During the early game you commonly put one in each corner and then put your tanks in the middle of front row. Once you reach level 4 you can put another tank in front, or you can put one as blitzcrank bait next to your primary sniper carry. When positioning snipers in the early game, make sure to let the weaker one get jumped by infilts or pulled by blitzcrank. If all the infilts are jumping to one side, you can move both snipers to the opposite side of where they're jumping. You rarely want to turtle when playing snipers, but if the enemy has some dangerous infiltrators, turtling to keep your snipers alive is better than taking a risk and losing your main source of damage. The mech spawns in the center of 3 mech pilots. When positioning the mech, you want to have one unit in the middle, and the other 2 far left and far right side on the same row. In this example, you move Annie next to Fist to make it spawn right side, and Fist next to Annie to make it spawn left side. The mech cleaves when it auto attacks, so in this example, Saya is getting hit by the mech even though she's behind 2 tanks. You need to be careful when you're turtling against the mech, as your frontline might not walk. It is random whether they walk or not, so it won't happen every time, but in this example the mech could walk all the way up and start damaging both Soraka and Cassiopeia. To counter the mech, you want to leave single units a bit out away from your team. In this example, if the mech spawns left side, it will only damage Cho'Gath, and if the mech spawns right side, it will only damage Vi. Here your carry stays safe and you take the least amount of damage from the mech as possible. Lastly, we will go over how to position with different items. There are a lot of items that do more or less work depending on how they are positioned. Bramble Vest deals damage to adjacent enemies that auto-attack them, therefore you want multiple people targeting the unit with Bramble Vest. This item also counters units like Aurelia, Jin, Vayne, and Xayah, as they often build Infinity Edge and deal significantly less damage to a unit with Bramble Vest. Chalice, Locket, and Zeeks buff the units next to them on the same row. It is important to not position worse to get more value out of the item. Getting some extra attack speed on a tank is nice, but it's not worth making your frontline weaker by doing so. Frozen Heart slows attack speed of adjacent units. If you make double Frozen Heart, the range is doubled, so it slows everyone within 2 hexes by 75%. This item is insanely strong on infiltrators and units like Wukong that can ult into big piles of enemies. A GA on a carry can let you worry less about infiltrators and position better for everyone else. When a unit dies with GA, they are still alive, so units that require kills to ramp up like Jinx don't benefit from it. Also, if you have a Frozen Heart or an Ionic Spark on a unit with GA, the effects are still active while the unit is reviving. Hajj gives either healing or extra damage to a champion. Whichever one of these you roll might impact your positioning. If you know that your carry will heal more, you might be okay with it taking some more small hits from AoE than if they just roll damage. Ionic Spark wants to be on either frontliners or infiltrators. You want this item to affect as many people as possible. If you get it on the enemy carries, they are much more vulnerable to spell damage and might also die from the damage it deals. Redemption wants to be on units that die fast, but not so fast that the rest of your team doesn't get value from it. The perfect holder of Redemption is Fiora in 6 Cybernetics. She is tanky enough to get one ult off, but after that she just dies. As she is the squishiest champ in Cybers, she is usually the first one to die, therefore a ton of other Cyber units get great value out of the item. Zephyr removes a champ for the first 5 seconds of the fight. It removes the champ on the same hex on the other board. Positioning when you have Zephyr is crucial, as you can Zephyr snipe the enemy carry and then just run through the enemy team. You can Zephyr snipe people by picking up the unit and then swapping to another board by pressing 1 or the 3 key. Then you can line up your champ to hit the enemy carry, and right before the round starts, press the 2 key to go back to your board and place the unit down. Shroud wants to be on a tank that can move around a lot. It gives 20% dodge chance, which is sort of like getting 20% more health. This unit wants to be 3rd row or front row, as here you get to hit 3 of the backline hexes. You can use the same technique mentioned earlier to Shroud snipe the important units like GP, Janna, or Xerath. Trapclaw is a good tank item that can stun an important enemy spellcaster. If you position your Trapclaw so that Teemo targets it, he will get stunned for 4 seconds after his first cast, thus effectively severing him at the start of the fight. This can also be used to counter Blitzcrank pulls, which can be powerful against Jinx, as it will be harder for her to get resets without getting a unit pulled in. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you learned something, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. If you want to get better at TFT, join the Discord. We got nearly over 1,000 other players who are hungry to climb over there. And if you want to get coached by me, the information is over on the Discord as well. Lastly, I want to thank you guys so much for 5,000 subscribers. The constant support from you guys is amazing and I am forever grateful. And as always, take care and see you in the next video.